Everyday Samurai, Episode 9. Greetings, friends. Welcome back, and welcome to Everyday Samurai, in service to your liberty and the security of a free state. We certainly trust that you're getting the most of the principles we talk about. You know, I find it quite refreshing to be principles-focused rather than being buffeted about by events, opinions, and propaganda. What I've found is that adopting a few simple principles grounded in truth liberates you from a great deal of uncertainty, ambiguity, and confusion. Since the nature of conflict is chaotic enough, having principles based upon the bedrock of reality is the best antidote to the fog of war. One of the greatest sources for a principled approach to resolving conflict is the tradition of natural rights and the theory of natural law. To start things off, I'll read for a bit from an essay on natural law by Lysander Spooner. The science of mine and thine, the science of justice, is the science of all human rights, of all a man's rights of person and property, of all his rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is the science which alone can tell any man what he can and cannot do, what he can and cannot have, what he can and cannot say without infringing the rights of any other person. It is the science of peace, and the only science of peace, since it is the science which alone can tell us what conditions mankind can live in peace or ought to live in peace with each other. And skipping ahead a bit, so long as these conditions are fulfilled, men are at peace and ought to remain at peace with each other. But when either of these conditions is violated, men are at war, and they must necessarily remain at war until justice is reestablished. And then further on, man no doubt owes many other moral duties to his fellow men, such as to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, shelter the homeless, care for the sick, protect the defenseless, assist the weak, and enlighten the ignorant. But these are simply moral duties, of which each man must be his own judge in each particular case as to whether and how far he can or will perform them. But of his legal duty, that is, of his duty to live honestly towards his fellow men not only may judge, but for their own protection must judge. And if need be, they may rightfully compel him to perform it. They may do this acting singly or in concert. They may do it on the instant, as the necessity arises, or deliberately and systematically, if they prefer to do so, and the exigency will admit of it. And later, to avoid the errors that are liable to result from haste and passion, and that everybody who desires it may rest secure in the assurance of protection without a resort to force, it is evidently desirable that men should associate, so far as they freely and voluntarily can do so, for the maintenance of justice among themselves and for mutual protection against other wrongdoers. In summation of the applicability of natural law, Spooner writes, although as illimitable in its application as the infinite relations and dealings of men with each other, it is, nevertheless, made up of few simple elementary principles, of the truth and justice of which every ordinary mind has an almost intuitive perception. Now, I'll delve into some passages from Igensho, the Book of Dignity, General Principles of Martial Art. And by the way, you can get a free PDF download of an outline of this life-changing book when you go to everydaysamurai.life/dignity. That's www.everydaysamurai.life/dignity. In the private sector, the strategy of deterrence is exemplified in the exercise of their right to keep and bear arms by some 80 million American citizens. In the United States, it is estimated that between 1.5 and 3 million times per year, citizens utilize rightfully owned firearms lawfully to halt crimes in progress, wherein grand juries and petty juries subsequently recognize a reasonable belief that there was an imminent threat to innocent life, thus finding that no crime has been committed by the armed citizen. In the vast majority of these cases, no rounds are discharged. In those American states where it is government policy to facilitate citizens in the exercise of their constitutional rights and responsibilities, the average number of citizens who choose to carry firearms is between 1 and 6% of the eligible population. In 1987, such states numbered only 10. At this writing, they number 38. Because the identities of these few armed citizens are unknown, the targeting at random of strangers becomes an exceedingly dangerous proposition for felons. Overwhelming evidence proves conclusively that where even 1% of eligible citizens exercise their right to go armed, crime remains consistently low. Where strict gun control measures are imposed by government, crime remains consistently high, except where draconian police powers are in force. With regard to these, it must be noted that where civil rights may be exercised only at the discretion of the police, there exists a police state. It is well to remember that martial art is the art of war, designed for use without reference to any restriction not imposed by strategic expediency. Therefore, the use of martial art by civilians at peace and subject to the rule of law and custom is a dangerous and complex problem. Attempts to restrict oneself to the moral or legal act may well result in defeat and death. Failure so to restrict oneself may result in prosecution and severe legal, social, and psychological consequences. Therefore, it is essential to know what one believes, what one's objectives are, and what consequences are acceptable. The effective and proper use of force to oppose a lethal threat is designed in the final case to annihilate the opposition. This is expressed by the term the force option. The force option consists in 3 integral components. First, possession of the mechanisms of lethal and destructive force, that is, the power to kill people and break things. Second, the means, and third, the will to use them. The objectives of using the force option are 3, as currently enumerated in U.S. military doctrine. These are deterrence, defense, and coercion. As there can be no positive without negative, no yo without in, so there can be no deterrence without the force option, no diplomacy without power. They are integral. Persons wishing to utilize martial art for the achievement of worthy ends by non-violent means may do so, when possible, only by cultivating a sound, integrated working knowledge of both elements. It is essential to understand this. Just as there is an element of light and darkness and of darkness and light, there is in diplomacy an element of threat based on the capacity to compel compliance without manifest violence, and when necessary, by the lethal and destructive use of force to defend dignity and life and to render justice. Now, to help us further understand what we've just talked about, we are joined by the author of Igen Sho, Karasuma Kantaro, or as we call him, Jim. Jim, welcome back to Everyday Samurai.
Good evening. How are you?
Very well, thanks. Glad you could be with us.
Thank you.
You describe diplomacy and power as balancing energies integral to the nature of reality. Can you elaborate further?
Well, first of all, there is no diplomacy without power. One cannot bargain effectively but from a position of strength. And with respect to matters of force, strength would consist in the ability to present a credible threat to the interlocutor, to the negotiators on the opposite side of the table. They're going to be making their evaluations and drawing their conclusions based on their understanding of your destructive and lethal capability and or intent, and on their understanding of your will to deploy force in service of your own policy objectives. And of course, you're making the same estimate on your side of the table. This is what negotiation is. It's what diplomacy is. I often think of a sort of cartoon image of a diplomat dressed in white tie and tails at some sort of elegant dinner in a European palace, holding a glass of champagne in his left hand, and behind his back in the right hand is a cocked and locked pistol. That's my image of diplomacy.
So the idea is to walk softly but carry a big stick?
Exactly so, yes.
Then when Spooner talks about there being only 2 options, either people are at peace or they are at war, Do you see that also as being integral to the nature of energy in the universe?
I think it is unrealistic to presume that we live at all times at the far extremes of the spectrum of war and peace. Most of the time, we're unable to prosecute wars for whatever the reason, because we lack the finances and the materials and the personnel and the training and the will to expend these things in service of some policy objective, which in most cases may not be worth the cost. So we live in relative peace most of the time. And just as you had mentioned earlier about yin and yo, or yin and yang, you have the little black fish with the little white eye chasing the little white fish with the little black eye. And so within that relative peace, there are frequent, if not constant, eruptions of warlike conditions between individuals or small groups of individuals, which may or may not involve the intervention of the state through its police powers. And when we are indeed at war on a national scale or an international scale, there are constantly efforts being made on both sides to find a means of halting hostilities and coming to some arrangement which is acceptable to both sides, because the costs of war, particularly of total war, which has been the way of war since probably the time of Napoleon, certainly since the American Civil War, are just too high. We cannot afford to sustain this kind of thing for very long, nor can we afford to do it very often, because the objectives of war usually involve some form of material gain. And if in the process of making war we destroy any material to be gained, including human populations, it becomes a self-defeating exercise. So we are always oscillating and negotiating in between conditions of relative peace and war. And in a society at peace, living under the rule of law, we generally negotiate these problems through the political system, through the legal system.
Through mediation systems?
Yeah, and the court of public opinion and all this kind of thing. And we don't have to resort to the use of force, or certainly not the massive and total use of force, which is war.
You made mention of the importance of transitioning from previous generations of war to industrial-sized war, as you indicated, the Civil War being one in the United States, if we want to use that term. And certainly the 20th century, we saw industrial-sized war on a global scale that was totally destructive and totally devastating to the industrial capacity of basically the entire world. Yet Sun Tzu talked about this 2,500 years before the current era, in indicating just how expensive war is and how destructive it is to the lives and livelihood of the common people. So war has always been inefficient, and Sun Tzu talked about the need to, or the desire to keep it whole, to end things without hostilities if needs be, and that is by adopting a superior strategy to defeat the enemy without actual conflict. Yet the categories that Spooner talks about, there's either peace or there is war. And even though it might not erupt into actual hostilities and conflict and destruction, the ideas of justice are relatively binary. Would you agree?
Yes, I would.
And with that in mind, when you have injustice and are looking to orchestrate and organize for justice, the means by which we correct infractions, whether it be mediation, whether it be lawsuit, whether it be engaging some form of civil authority, that's when there's nuance. But understand the principle is what natural law is all about.
Yes, I would agree. And again, I think we want to clarify for the listener that there are two elements of natural law. There is what we refer to generally as the laws of nature, which is gravity and the laws of thermodynamics and so forth. These laws of nature are laws because they are autonomic. They are self-enforcing. They don't require any human intervention to make them work. They simply cannot be violated. Then there are the laws of human nature, which operate exclusively within human society. These, in my view, fall into categories, one of which is the so-called natural law, so labeled by John Locke, And the other is what I would refer to as synthetic law, which is laws made by human beings for their own purposes, whether for good or evil purposes. Synthetic law, in my view, can be good law if and only if it manifests in human society the natural law of Locke. Other synthetic laws which violate the laws of Locke's morality or of Spooner or whomever of the Enlightenment or classical libertarian philosophers you may choose, anytime that governments or private organizations of citizens where there is no government, in lieu of government, make and enforce synthetic laws which are inconsistent with what I generally refer to as the law of justice and the law of propriety, are laws which in themselves are the engines of injustice. And to put it in broader and perhaps more familiar terms for a great many people, what we refer to as the good is the product of justice manifest in human action.
Aristotle talked about the reason for having politics in the first place was so that men, the entire human family, could live together in what he termed the good life. So the whole reason for political society is to increase or to maintain a good standard of living for those that come together and live as a community. And what you made mention of earlier was Locke, and of course you're referring to John Locke and his second treatise of government. So what's your conception of Locke's standard of justice?
Well, before I proceed with that, let me just balance out the last thought, which is that good is the product of justice manifest in human action, and that evil is the consequence of injustice manifest in human action. John Locke and many other thinkers of the Enlightenment from the 17th through the 19th centuries, including the founders of the United States, were fundamentally basing their view on the idea of individual rights. The word justice is rooted in the Latin jus, which means right. Now, people have been thinking and arguing for thousands of years about what that means. And I have tried to understand it for my own purposes by attempting to devise a practical working definition of what a right is. And the best I've been able to do is say that a right is the unique product of the individual human mind, that it consists in any claim based in reason, which is to say in fact and in logic, which is binding and compelling in conscience, and defensible by force against aggression. A right is a warrant of freedom from aggression and of freedom of proper action being any action which does not involve aggression. So rights fall generally two broad categories, negative and positive. And I know there are folks who believe that there are no there are no positive rights. But let me, with respect to our current discussion, say that all negative rights are reducible to freedom from aggression. And all positive rights consist in freedom of proper action, which is any action involving no aggression. And as William Blackstone, the great jurist of England at the time of our founding, said, the law of self-defense is the first law of nature. This is probably, along with the right of private property, the fundamental, seminal, positive right. The right to oppose aggression, first by recourse to reason, and finally by resort to force.
And the orchestration of the use of force is generally what people come to mind when thinking of politics or government, the nature of government. And as we've talked about earlier, there's the quote that was popular among the founders of the United States that if men were angels, no government would be necessary at all. Yet we understand that within the human heart, there are those that would prefer to live through predation than through their own production, or to live peaceably with fellow mankind and trade for their good rather than taking that good through force. And again, we recognize that it's relatively simple. And as Spooner talks about, even a child, or it's relatively intuitive to understand when someone takes what belongs to someone else is wrong. So government is ostensibly brought into form, and we know that this is talking about legal theory, and we use John Locke and before him Thomas Hobbes to look at mankind or the human in a state of nature as a thought experiment, just like Einstein used thought experiments to develop his theories of relativity and quantum mechanics. The legal philosophers that we associate with the Enlightenment used thought experiments to imagine the individual out in nature, outside of society, so that they could then discern what is good, what is right, what is the natural law. And from that standard, they could come up with, well, the nature of man is sometimes erratic, sometimes full of hate, sometimes greedy. Therefore, you need someone to govern over and lord over them, like in the idea of Thomas Hobbes. And then there were others like John Locke that rejected that said, no, mankind can live peaceably among one another, and they can understand through property rights when an injustice has been committed. So looking through the lens of property rights, we do have these clear lines, and that they do conform with natural law. And there's only really two differences. Either you are living at peace or you are living against that natural law, and that is the state of war. So do those two terms start to make clarity, even though we understand that there are degrees in practice, but the theory is still binary?
Indeed. And this Spooner refers to the difference between morality and law, but I think that, again, good law is nothing more than morality, well, our morality, which is the morality of justice, because there are many moralities, many of which, in my view, serve the purposes of evil. But the morality of justice is served by a very few good synthetic laws, whereas the objectives or consequences of injustice tend to be caused by the fabrication of synthetic laws by human beings in violation of the fundamental law of justice. So if you would like to refer to these as being states of war and peace, very well. You can just state that as a given for the sake of argument.
I noticed that in my experience as a law enforcement officer, I would spent more time enforcing legislation than I did actually enforcing law. And the state of law enforcement today is really just enforcer for the state, rather than actually upholding property rights or keeping the peace. It's, as you said, synthetic law that can be perverted. And it's exactly what Friedrich Bastiat talked about in his pamphlet called The Law, is how the law becomes perverted by legislation. And Spooner talks about that as well, because, again, if mankind were angels, then no government would be necessary. But at the same time, governments are inhabited by human beings, and they don't lose their self-interest just because they hold public office. And that's one of the reasons why, as you indicated in Egan's show, the importance of an armed citizenry that is able to defend themselves, and as Spooner indicates, that to be able to join the defensive alliance of their choice so that they can defend against the aggression inherent to governments that get out of hand, that no longer obey or conform with natural law.
Indeed. Kind of funny little anecdote comes to mind. I had never in my life considered the idea of entering law enforcement because I had seen it very much as the force arm of a semi-tyrannical state, even here at home in America. But at one point, I had been unemployed for a period of about 8 months, and I had been running around chasing jobs all over the place. And a friend of mine brought it to my attention that the local police department was hiring, and he said, you ought to go down and apply. And I said, you must be joking. And he said, no, I think you ought to consider it. Well, I put it out of my mind, and then after another few months, another police department started hiring, and I said, you know what the hell, I've got to get a job. So I went down and applied, and did fine on the academic and the physical parts of the testing, and then there was an interview. And the interview was very interesting. They had 3 sergeants behind a desk on an elevated dais, and the applicant was placed behind a small school-type desk located with his head about 4 or 5 feet below those of the examiners so as to allow them to look down on him and try to intimidate him and try to push his button and see how he'd react. So I sat there and did my best to answer their various questions. And they made a great show of complete contempt for all of my various answers to see if they could intimidate me. And I was not even annoyed by this. It was clear what they were, the game that they were playing. Whereupon one sergeant looked down and said, with an expression of complete disbelief on his face, he said to me, "Well, just exactly what is it that you think a police officer does?" And I had never actually considered that carefully before. And I said, "Well, I would think that police officer defends life and property and keeps the peace." Whereupon these guys all looked at each other with, looks on their faces like, this guy must be crazy. And I realized later that the answer they were looking for was simply to say a policeman enforces the law. But they sent me home, and I got a letter a few weeks later saying, "Don't call us, we'll call you." But, that sort of illustrates your point, I think.
Well, let me take a quick time out and talk about it. When I was about to deploy to Iraq, and my teacher from Japan had come over to the U.S. to give a seminar, and I told him I was getting ready to deploy, and he said the best advice that he could give me was to maintain my flexibility in a physical sense in order to deal with all that stress. And he even took the time out the next day to go through a special stretching sequence. But now over a decade after that, I really wish I had followed that advice and been more consistent with stretching and mobility training, because let's face it, it's usually the most boring and least rewarding aspect of a workout, and it's usually the part we skip over when time is short. But what if there was a way that was really satisfying to build strength and endurance while shredding fat in a way that improves your mobility and puts you in a relaxed flow state? I'm talking about the kind of workout you can get done in less than an hour with just your body weight and know that you are getting the kind of fitness that will make you a more resilient warrior. That's exactly what this 6-Degree Flow program is all about. 6-Degree Flow is a mobility-focused, expertly instructed workout that's built around the physiology and psychology of the flow state. You'll feel the return of your body's proper alignment like never before, particularly if you've got a few hard miles under your belt or stiff spots in the body. This is a yoga-based fitness program for the modern warrior. I finally made a commitment to sticking with a power yoga practice, and with 6-Degree Flow, you can too. Check it out at everydaysamurai.life/flow. There are more than 75 instructional and follow-along videos, along with 4 detailed booklets describing the science of it all. In this program, it gives you everything you need to restore your strength, flexibility, and stamina so you can perform your best. That's www.everydaysamurai.life/flow. So, Jim, I got to tell you that I got into law enforcement for no other reason than to get involved in the war on drugs. And I did it on the local, the state, and the federal level, and then the international level, and even exported the war on drugs to Africa on behalf of the U.S. government. And I got to tell you that it's a giant scam, and that's exactly what led me to realize that this type of legislation that doesn't conform with natural law is really just an excuse for those working in the state to expropriate more resources from the citizenry and then use those resources to more centralize their power and authority. I got to tell you that one of the most eye-opening things, not only from seeing the amounts of money that are being spent and just the devastating impact that enforcing the legislation that prohibits possession and use of private property basically is just how we are regulating people's lives. And one of the most eye-opening books that helped me understand this was Bureaucracy by Ludwig von Mises. Because no matter how well-intended we might be, it's the fact that bureaucracies, just like socialist commonwealths, cannot do rational economic calculation, especially when we're talking about desires of consumers. And that type of legislation can only create distortions in society and move us away from the good life and the peaceable life. And I got to see it firsthand. How about you?
Well, I can't say that I have that kind of direct experience, but I have been observing this kind of thing for many years. And another, I think, very telling example that comes to mind are the civil forfeiture laws, which are a license for law enforcement agencies to perform armed robbery against citizens, some of whom may indeed be guilty of violations of synthetic law, but many of whom are actually entirely innocent of any crime, or whether it be against the laws of nature or the synthetic law of government. And while cutting funds for police departments, the various local, state, or federal government sources of funding passed these laws enabling police departments and other law enforcement agencies literally to rob innocent citizens of their property in order to finance their operations, and in cases of even what the government itself would consider corruption, to steal these resources and use them for their own private purposes.
And that goes back to, again, Aristotle talked about the whole reason for politics is to enjoy the good life in society, to increase your well-being. And anytime that you are stealing from somebody or even depleting the available savings in society, you're minimizing the capital base, therefore minimizing the available savings available to loan out to entrepreneurs, to invest, to research, to develop, to come up with new goods and services that increase the material well-being of everyone else. So the state, by taking on these perversions of legislation away from natural law, we are painting the bad guys in society as not being worthy, and that taking these things from them is somehow protecting the rest of society. And it's a very elaborate propaganda tool to keep this thing perpetuated. And certainly growing up in the 80s and seeing the big campaign under Reagan and his wife Nancy about just say no to drugs and get tough on the war on drugs that he inherited from Nixon, etc. Man, I really bought into that hook, line, and sinker, so to speak. I mean, I grew up under that propaganda, and that's exactly why I wanted to get into law enforcement in the first place. But when you look at it from the standpoint of natural law, and if you have any understanding of economic reasoning, then you see just what deleterious effects it is to deplete the savings base in society and therefore remove the possibility of greater goods and services that come through entrepreneurship.
Indeed. I think one can sort of simplify this whole problem in a sense by reducing it to this proposition that wherever there is life, which includes all forms of life, there is predation. And predation is the natural process of survival and reproduction within the Darwinist theory of evolution and so forth. Most species attack and consume other species in order to survive and to reproduce. But most species do not involve themselves in aggression. There are a few exceptions to the rule. There are some animals which will, like weasels or things which will go, let's say, into a chicken coop and destroy all the eggs and not eat them. It seems to be they're doing it for fun or something, I don't know. And there are people like this as well. So predation is not in any way against the laws of nature. It is the law of nature. However, so we can say wherever there is life, there is predation, but wherever there is human life, there is aggression, which is the initiation of force in deliberate violation of the rights of human beings. And most of the time, human beings act as predators toward non-human species. We eat meat or whatever, and some people are, morally set against that, which is an argument that they can make. But when human beings prey on one another, it is not by cause of any necessity. It is merely a criminal act of violating the rights of other human beings for whatever purpose or for no purpose. So where there is life, there is predation, but where there is human life, there is always aggression. And this is the factor that necessitates the use of force in defense of justice and in opposition to aggression. And this is the source of politics. It's the source of government. It's the source of martial art.
I remember watching a very profound nature show when I was a teenager, and I was always fascinated with those types of shows. Of course, I think back then it was only PBS. Now we have more Discovery Channel and Animal Planet and all these other available channels that are only because of modern technology and, again, the expansion of the capital base, etc. But that's another story. What struck me about this one episode was when a baby chimpanzee got separated from his tribe and wound up in a neighboring tribe's territory. And that other chimpanzee clan grabbed that baby and ate it alive. And it was very graphic footage to see this little baby chimpanzee being eaten alive, pretty close up footage. But it shows that there is aggression and there is this sense of territoriality amongst the animal kingdom.
Well, I wouldn't call that aggression. That is an instinct for the survival of the individual clan, which requires that the population in its territory be kept down. Human beings know a lot better than that. And what they will do is not merely to defend their own area of operations, if you wish, but to invade others and conquer them by main force, and enslave the populations or kill them and seize the natural resources. This is not predation, this is aggression.
What allows human beings to elevate beyond this type of aggression and predation that's found in the animal kingdom is the faculty of reason.
Oh, yes.
And the faculty of reason is also the means by which we can discern and know and apply natural law.
Exactly.
So in the remaining minutes that we have, I just want to take a second and discuss the importance of mindset, not only for prevailing in conflict and for arising above the conflict that we see out in the world of effect, but also for living a victorious life in general. There are a lot of lessons out there that we can talk about, and some of them have only become available to me after many years of struggling in frustration and bumping around in the search for answers to life's deeper meaning, like how to be happy and successful. The trouble was the answers were right in front of me and I dismissed them. That's why it's so important to do two things. The first is to take on new information in layers, that is, small applications of new ideas and bite-sized chunks that are easy to mentally digest over time with consistency. And the other is to have a coach, someone you can trust and guide you in the right direction. If there is anything in your life that you want to improve, whether it's your health, relationships, finances, or success overall, I recommend you look at this revolutionary coaching program from Bob Proctor called 6 Minutes to Success. It's about adopting a new paradigm or approach to life with a video coaching program that comes to you wherever you are every day, all for less than the price of a cup of coffee. As long as you have access to the internet, you can get coaching and results that stick from a master in the field. The secret to massive gains is really about doing a little bit every day. Do yourself the service of adopting a success mindset the easy way. Go to www.everydaysamurai.life/success. Plus, the downloadable material you'll find in this program will blow you away. Join me in the members area. That's everydaysamurai.life/success. So, Jim, I think one of the last things that we can talk about today is the application of natural law in human society. And you talked about how it was incorporated into the U.S. Constitution, most notably in the Second Amendment, and the reliance upon the people as militia to execute the laws and to repel invasions and suppress insurrections. And then on the international scale, by applying military science. So what can somebody who is listening to this and is reading your book, not necessarily associated with any particular organization, but what can they take away and start looking, again, applying it in layers to improve that source of justice when they look at things out in the world, when they see the news, when they hear the different types of propaganda out there? How can they start to look for that balance between light and dark, between peace and war?
You had earlier quoted from Lysander Spooner, and one or two comments just come to mind from that. First of all, elsewhere, I can't quote, and I can't remember exactly where in his writings I encountered this, but he did make a vigorous defense of the Second Amendment and the right to keep and bear arms. as a component of his larger philosophy. In answer to your question, which is very large, well, I would just say this, as I think I might have mentioned earlier. The 17th century French Enlightenment philosopher Blaise Pascal said the first moral obligation is to think clearly. And I would simply add that the genesis of clear thinking is to question everything with no particular end in view. That is to say, not to question in service of your own point of view, but what scientists would call disinterested inquiry, to try by means of reasoning to answer the questions which can be asked about virtually every phenomenon of human action. Think and question. Think for yourself. Consider all possible points of view with an open mind, without preconceptions, without prejudice. That is the beginning of wisdom, as far as I can make out. And that is the way that every rational mind has access through its own reasoning to discover for oneself the fundamental principles of justice, the laws of nature, and to be able to distinguish between good synthetic law and synthetic law which is antithetical to the good.
Friends, we hope you've enjoyed today's episode of Everyday Samurai and look forward to seeing you next time. Be sure to subscribe to our feed to stay up to date with our newest offerings. If you like what you've heard here, give us a thumbs up or a 5-star review. Share it with a friend or someone you think would benefit from the message. Remember, the free PDF outline of Egan's show, The Book of Dignity, is available our compliments to you at www.everydaysamurai.life/dignity. Until next time, stay sharp, stay aware, and be well.